Hello, this is Dr. Miller again. Up to this point in the course, we've been looking at straightforward, relatively simple arguments that have a single set of premises and a single conclusion. In the real world, however, you'll often encounter arguments that have a more complex structure. To help us analyze and evaluate these more complex arguments, I want to introduce two new terms today, subargument and subconclusion. Consider this argument. Parents bring children into the world and spend many years caring for them while they are young. They often make enormous sacrifices for the sake of their offspring, and thus children owe a great debt to their parents. The best way for children to repay this debt is by taking care of their parents when the parents become too old to care for themselves. Consequently, adult children should be legally required to provide support for their elderly parents. How would you analyze this argument? How would you put it into standard form? Hit the pause button if you need a moment to think about it. You probably noticed the conclusion indicator consequently in the last sentence, and you probably realized that the ultimate conclusion of the argument in this passage is that adult children should be legally required to provide support for their elderly parents. This is the main point of the argument, the statement the arguer is trying to get us to accept or believe. In addition, you were probably able to identify several of the premises the arguer is offering in support of this conclusion. But did you also notice the word thus in the second sentence? If you did, you may have wondered what this conclusion indicator is doing here, far removed from the argument's ultimate conclusion. What does it tell us about the argument's structure? What role does the statement it's attached to, the statement that children owe a great debt to their parents, play in the argument as a whole? Well, here the word thus is indicating the presence of what we call a subargument and a subconclusion. The arguer is using the statement that children owe a great debt to their parents as a premise in her main argument, but instead of simply asserting this premise, she also gives us reasons for accepting or believing it. In effect, offering us an argument within an argument that has this statement as its conclusion. We call this mini argument a subargument to distinguish it from the larger argument of which it's a part, and we call its conclusion a subconclusion to distinguish it from the ultimate conclusion of the argument as a whole. When you're analyzing a complex argument like this one, it's important to identify all the subarguments it contains. There might be only one subargument, as in this example, but in other cases there might be more than one. In fact, arguers sometimes give subarguments to support each of the premises they want to use in their main argument. And of course, they don't always use conclusion indicators like thus or therefore to highlight these subarguments. In some cases, you'll find premise indicators like because, since, and for in subarguments. In other cases, there won't be any indicator words within the subargument at all, and you'll just have to use common sense and look at the argument's larger context in order to decide what its structure is. In standard form, the complex argument I've been using as an example would look something like this. We have a subargument consisting of two premises, P1 and P2, and the subconclusion labeled SC. But SC itself, the claim that children owe a great debt to their parents, is also a premise in the arguer's main argument. The arguer is implying that not only SC and P3 give us good reasons for accepting that adult children should be legally required to provide support for their elderly parents, but also that P1 and P2 give us good reasons for accepting SC. To evaluate a complex argument, you need to evaluate each of the subarguments as well as the main argument. It's generally a good idea to examine the subarguments first. In this case, you'd have to ask yourself first whether you judge P1 and P2 to be plausible, and second, whether they provide logical support for the subconclusion SC. If you find that the subargument meets both the truth condition and the logic condition, you have a good reason for accepting the subconclusion SC as plausible or true. If you find that the subargument fails to meet either of these conditions, you would have to say that the arguer has not given us good reasons for accepting SC. Once you've evaluated all the subarguments, you would then go on to evaluate the main argument. If you've judged a given subargument favorably, in effect you've already decided that its subconclusion is true or at least plausible. On the other hand, if you've found flaws in a subargument, that means you don't think the arguer has given good reasons for us to accept its subconclusion. You might find that the subconclusion isn't plausible at all. Alternatively, you might think that the subargument could be strengthened somehow, or you might find its subconclusion to be plausible on other grounds. Whatever you decide, you would then need to go on to consider the main argument's other premises, asking whether each of them is plausible or true, and whether, taken together, all these premises provide support for the main argument's ultimate conclusion. Your answer to these questions will determine how you evaluate the complex argument as a whole.